historical and philosophical perspectives, and Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was born in 1770 in Stuttgart, Württemberg, which was then one of numerous autonomous German principalities that would become the German state in 1871. His eventual preoccupation with the link between human experience and history can be traced to the uncertainties of the time and place in which he lived. The German urban middle class, which made up his early social environment, expressed Enlightenment optimism and faith in human progress, but it was numerically and politically weaker than the middle class elsewhere in northwestern Europe. Many young cosmopolitan Germans viewed England and France with envy and resentment as their hopes for German progress and reform were consistently thwarted by an aristocracy that clung to old feudal privileges and institutions and suppressed criticism whenever it felt threatened. The old order was especially anxious after the French Revolution began in 1789, a war that would lead to the dissolution of aristocratic institutions and the execution of many aristocrats, including the French monarch. These events would have a profound impact on the worldviews of Hegel and other intellectuals of his generation. In 1788, when he was 18, Hegel entered the Protestant Theological Seminary in Tübingen, following in the footsteps of the several generations of Lutheran pastors from whom he had descended. However, he never really acclimated to seminary life. He learned more from his studies outside of official theology and, above all, from the friendships he made there with fellow students Friedrich Hölderlin, who would become one of Germany's great Romantic poets, and Friedrich Schelling, the future idealist philosopher. The three friends exchanged ideas, excitedly watched the events in France unfold, and participated in societies in which students discussed and promoted revolutionary ideals. Following his graduation, Hegel did not become a pastor. Instead, he worked as a private tutor for wealthy families in Bern and Frankfurt, devoting his free time to the study of philosophy and theology. Much of his writing represents an attempt to come to grips with Christianity, to wrestle with the significance of Christ and his teachings, and to outline the historical legacy of the Christian Church and its cultural and social implications as an institution. Hegel's lifelong claim that he was an Orthodox Lutheran may be subject to question, as it could have easily been motivated by the religious intolerance of the Prussian state, but his philosophy is heavily influenced by theological language, and a theological outlook colors his vision of human experience. When Hegel's father died, Hegel received a modest inheritance, which allowed him to pursue his academic career. In 1801, he went to the city of Jena to work as a private professor. At the time, Jena was a center of intense intellectual and artistic creativity, and one of the epicenters of German Romanticism, a diverse movement that challenged the rationality and sober-mindedness that characterized the Age of Enlightenment. Hegel consorted with philosophers and poets and began to envision his own unique philosophical approach. He sought to combine his diverse influences, including Kantian idealism, theology, Romanticism, and contemporary political and social theory, which all contribute to his philosophical voice. Early examples of this emerging voice include the difference between the philosophical systems of Fichte and Schelling, 1801, in which he begins to critique some of the basic assumptions of Kantian idealism, and an 1802 essay on natural law, in which he formulates a philosophical approach to the analysis of culture, modernity, and modern institutions. In 1807, the year after Napoleon marched into Prussia, Hegel published the Phenomenology of Spirit, an ambitious and difficult philosophical treatise. Here, Hegel fully elaborates some of his most striking and innovative concepts, such as the idea of spirit or collective consciousness, and his view that consciousness and knowledge develop dialectically in a repeating pattern. After teaching in Bamberg and Nuremberg, where he met his wife, Hegel took up a professorship in Heidelberg and, later, took another at the new university in Berlin. Hegel's output from this period includes the 3-volume Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Science, 1817, in which he systematizes his approach to philosophy, and Elements of a Philosophy of Right, 1821, which combines his philosophical insights with analysis and critique of modern society and modern political institutions. Hegel's students of this period include liberal civil servants in Prussian government, a fact that points to the widening and influential audience Hegel commanded in the years leading up to his death in 1831. Although Hegel's status in the field of philosophy has varied in the nearly 2 centuries since his death, his reflections have considerably influenced other disciplines as well, including literary and cultural theory, theology, sociology, and political science. His lifespan roughly coincides with the German composer Beethoven, 1770 to 1827, whose greatness rests partly in the way he took neoclassical musical conventions in new directions and incorporated diverse influences into his music in novel and idiosyncratic ways. Similarly, the originality of Hegel's insights stems partly from his adaptation of the available philosophical language to describe aspects of human experience that were beyond the immediate concerns of his philosophical predecessors. Like them, Hegel would devote a great deal of intellectual effort wrestling with the nature and possibilities of human knowledge. However, he also sought to understand his rapidly changing world and to describe the social, institutional, and historical dimensions of human experience. Themes, arguments, and ideas. Dialectic as the fundamental pattern of thought. Before Hegel, the word dialectic referred to the process of argument and refutation through which philosophers sought to discover the truth. Plato's dialogues offer the prime example. One person advances a proposition or belief, and Socrates refutes it and shows why that proposition is wrong, which clears the way for a better, more convincing argument to take its place. The point of dialectical reasoning before Hegel was to clear away misconceptions and arrive at first principles, basic fundamental truths on which we can all agree, and that the philosopher can use as a starting point on which to base a philosophical system, such as Descartes' famous principle that if we're thinking, we can at least be sure that we exist. Hegel used the dialectic for a different purpose than arriving at first principles. To understand what the dialectic means for Hegel, we have to first understand that Hegel was an idealist in the tradition of his predecessor, Kant. Like Kant, Hegel believed that we do not perceive the world or anything in it directly, and that all our minds have access to is ideas of the world, images, perceptions, concepts. For Kant and Hegel, the only reality we know is a virtual reality. Hegel's idealism differs from Kant's in 2 ways. First, Hegel believed that the ideas we have of the world are social, which is to say that the ideas that we possess individually are utterly shaped by the ideas that other people possess. Our minds have been shaped by the thoughts of other people through the language we speak, the traditions and mores of our society, and the cultural and religious institutions of which we are a part. Spirit is Hegel's name for the collective consciousness of a given society, which shapes the ideas and consciousness of each individual. The second way that Hegel differs from Kant is that he sees spirit as evolving according to the same kind of pattern in which ideas might evolve in an argument, namely the dialectic. First, there is a thesis, an idea or proposition about the world and how we relate to it. Every thesis or idea about the world contains an inherent contradiction or flaw, which thus gives rise to its antithesis, a proposition that contradicts the thesis. Finally, the thesis and antithesis are reconciled into a synthesis, a new idea combining elements of both. Essentially, Hegel sees human societies evolving in the same way that an argument might evolve. An entire society or culture begins with one idea about the world, which naturally and irresistibly evolves into a succession of different ideas through a dialectical pattern. Since Hegel believes that this succession is logical, meaning that it could only happen one way, he thinks that we can figure out the entire course of human history without recourse to archaeology or other empirical data, but purely through logic. Spirit as the self-awareness of society. The German word that is normally translated as spirit in English versions of Hegel is Geist, a word that can mean both spirit and mind, depending on the context. Hegel uses it to refer to the collective consciousness of a society, in the sense that we might speak, following Hegel, of the spirit of the age. In both English and German, spirit can also mean a ghost, and it can be used to refer to religious phenomena as well. Both of these senses are relevant to Hegel's term because the collective dimension of consciousness, what we might call culture, is similarly intangible and mysterious. Spirit is located neither in objects nor in individual minds, but in a non-material third realm that contains ideas that a whole society has in common. Spirit does not exist from the earliest moments of human history, but is instead a modern phenomenon toward which humanity had to evolve. According to the process outlined in the Phenomenology of Spirit, human consciousness starts from a position of trying to grasp objects through sensory inputs and moves on to more sophisticated ways of relating to the external world, until it finally reaches the level of spirit. At this stage, consciousness understands that individuals are bound to other individuals in a single communal consciousness, or culture. Spirit is the self-consciousness of the community, the whole of which individuals are only a part. As the consciousness of spirit unfolds and changes, so do the values and actions of the individual parts of which it is made. Lordship and bondage. As the basis of social relations. Hegel agrees with other idealists, such as Kant, that consciousness of an object necessarily implies consciousness of a subject, which is a self perceiving the object. In other words, human beings are not only conscious of objects, but also self-conscious. Hegel takes this view a step further to suggest that self-consciousness involves not only a subject and an object, but other subjects as well. Individuals become aware of selves through the eyes of another. Thus, true self-consciousness is a social process and involves a moment of radical identification with another consciousness, a taking on of another's view of the world to obtain a self-image. Consciousness of self is always consciousness of the other. In relationships of inequality and dependence, the subordinate partner, the bondsman, is always conscious of his subordinate status in the eyes of the other, while the independent partner, the lord, enjoys the freedom of negating consciousness of the subordinate other who is unessential to him. However, in doing so, the lord is uneasy because he has negated consciousness with which he has radically identified in order to assure himself of his independent and free status. In short, he feels guilty for denying the moment of mutual identification and sameness to preserve his sense of independence and superiority. Social life is founded on this dynamic of competing moments of mutual identification and objectification, of identifying with and also distancing oneself from the other. True. Ethical life as the expression of an age. Ethical life is a given cultural expression of spirit, the collective entity that transcends all individuals and determines their beliefs and actions, whether they are aware of it or not. Ethical life reflects the fundamental interdependence among individuals in a society and finds articulation in their shared customs and morals. Hegel argues that the tendency in modern life characterized by economic individualism and the Enlightenment idea of the individual as a subject possessing various rights represents a movement away from the recognition of essential social bonds. Before the Enlightenment, human beings were generally considered in terms of how they fit into social hierarchies and communal institutions, but following Enlightenment thinkers such as Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Kant, the individual on his own came to be considered sacred. In the philosophy of right, Hegel explains that the modern state is the institution that will correct this imbalance in modern culture. Although economic and legal individualism play a positive role in modern society, Hegel foresees the need for institutions that will affirm common bonds and ethical life while preserving individual freedom. He believes, for example, that the state must regulate the economy and provide for the poor in society, and that there should be corporative institutions, somewhat similar to modern trade unions, in which different occupational groups affirm a sense of social belonging and a feeling of being connected to larger society. Phenomenology of Spirit, Chapters 1 to 3. Shapes of Consciousness. Summary. Hegel attempts to outline the fundamental nature and conditions of human knowledge in these first 3 chapters. He asserts that the mind does not immediately grasp the objects in the world, concurring with Kant, who said that knowledge is not knowledge of things in themselves or of pure inputs from the senses. A long-standing debate raged in philosophy between those who believed that matter was the most important part of knowledge and those who privileged mind. Rationalists such as Descartes, and before him Plato, believed that we can only trust the truths that the mind arrives at on its own, while empiricists such as Locke argued that all of our knowledge comes from our perceptions of actual objects through our senses. Kant had sought to put this debate to rest by arguing that the meaning of objects derives from ideas or concepts that stand between mind and matter. The information entering the mind via the senses is always mediated by concepts. In the first part of the Phenomenology, Hegel demonstrates that though concepts do in fact mediate matter, as Kant maintains, Hegel's own understanding of the way concepts come into being implies a certain instability or insecurity in knowledge, which Kant overlooks. Whereas Kant seems to imply that an individual's mind controls thought, Hegel argues that a collective component to knowledge also exists. In fact, according to Hegel, tension always exists between an individual's unique knowledge of things and the need for universal concepts. 2 movements that represent the first and second of the 3 so-called modes of consciousness. The first mode of consciousness, meaning or sense certainty, is the mind's initial attempt to grasp the nature of a thing. This primary impulse runs up against the requirement that concepts have a universal quality, which means that different people must also be able to comprehend these concepts. This requirement leads to the second mode of consciousness, perception. With perception, consciousness, in its search for certainty, appeals to categories of thought worked out between individuals through some kind of communicative process at the level of common language. Expressed more simply, the ideas we have of the world around us are shaped by the language we speak, so that the names and meanings that other people have worked out before us throughout the history of language shape our perceptions. Consciousness is always pulled in 2 different directions. Our senses give us a certain kind of evidence about the world, and the categories through which we make sense of the world, categories that we learned when we learned language, tell us what the input of our senses means. The fact that a difference exists between perceptions and the meanings we give to them gives rise to a feeling of uncertainty or skepticism that is built into the very mechanism by which minds come to know objects. That is, to the extent that consciousness can grasp categories of thought, it is at the same time aware of the inadequacy of these categories and thus moved to find new ground for sense certainty, generating new concepts that smooth over the contradictions. This striving is constantly frustrated. The categories of thought reveal their inner contradictions, and consciousness is moved to posit more adequate categories. Although sense certainty is in some ways always elusive, this process of moving from less satisfactory to more satisfactory categories entails a kind learning process. Hegel calls this process understanding, the third and highest mode of consciousness. Analysis. For the unprepared lay reader, Phenomenology of Spirit, the earliest of Hegel's major mature works, can be a frustrating introduction to his highly idiosyncratic and difficult philosophical style. The difficulty arises in part because Hegel, working within the tradition of German idealism, was attempting to grapple with dimensions of human experience that lie largely outside the scope of this tradition, which was established above all by Kant. While deeply indebted to Kant, Hegel did not find the language of idealism wholly adequate to explain what he felt needed explaining, and he had to invent his own philosophical terms, which at first seem unfamiliar and strange. The difficulty of phenomenology also lies in the work's extraordinary ambition. In one dizzying gesture, the 27-year-old Hegel attempts to outline and define all the diverse dimensions of human experience as he sees them. Knowledge and perception, consciousness and subjectivity, social interaction, culture, history, morality, and religion. The result is chaotic, and his points are often difficult to grasp, but the work is ultimately highly rewarding for those with the right mix of patience and imagination required to decode Hegel. The spirit of man has broken with the old order of things, is the dramatic but fitting statement with which Hegel introduces Phenomenology of Spirit. Here he sets out his agenda for a systematic philosophy, the subject of which is not simply the knowing and perceiving individual mind, as it was for his immediate philosophical heirs such as Kant, but social beings who are oriented to the world collectively through culture. The individual is not simply standing directly opposite objects, but rather is forced to mediate between the subjective and the collective moments of understanding. That is, between his own immediate perceptions and the ideas about the world that he shares with the people around him. In these early sections of Phenomenology of Spirit, we get an early glimpse of this approach, the famous dialectic, the idea that knowledge is a process of striving to arrive at stable and truthful categories of thought. Knowledge as motion is a recurrent theme in Hegel's writings and forms the core of his highly original approach to epistemology. Phenomenology of Spirit, Chapter 4, Self-Consciousness, Summary. Hegel moves from the discussion of consciousness in general to a discussion of self-consciousness. Like the idealist philosophers before him, Hegel believes that consciousness of objects necessarily implies some awareness of self as a subject which is separate from the perceived object. But Hegel takes this idea of self-consciousness a step further and asserts that subjects are also objects to other subjects. Self-consciousness is thus the awareness of another's awareness of oneself. To put it another way, one becomes aware of oneself by seeing oneself through the eyes of another. Hegel speaks of the struggle for recognition implied in self-consciousness. This struggle is between two opposing tendencies arising in self-consciousness. Between, on one hand, the moment when the self and the other come together, which makes self-consciousness possible, and on the other hand, the moment of difference arising when one is conscious of the otherness, of other selves vis-à-vis oneself, and vice versa. Otherness and pure self-consciousness are mutually opposed moments in a life and death struggle for recognition. This tension between selves and others, between mutual identification and estrangement, plays out in the fields of social relations. Hegel explains that the realization of self-consciousness is really a struggle for recognition between two individuals bound to one another as unequals in a relationship of dependence. One person is the bondsman and one is the servant. The bondsman, or servant, is dependent on the Lord, because he is aware that the Lord sees him as an object rather than as a subject, that is, as a thing rather than as a thinking, self-aware being. The Lord frustrates his desire to assert his pure self-consciousness. He is stuck in a position of reflecting on his otherness. The independent Lord, on the other end, is able to negate the otherness that he finds reflected through the subordinate bondsman, since the bondsman does not appear as a conscious subject to him. As the independent and superior partner in this relationship, his otherness does not bear down on him. The Lord occupies the position of enjoying his dominant status, whereas the bondsman must continuously reflect on his status as a subordinate other for the Lord. At the same time, the Lord does not find his position completely satisfying. In negating his own otherness in the consciousness of the bondsman, in turning the bondsman into an object unessential to his own self-consciousness, he has also to deny a fundamental impulse toward recognizing the bondsman as a consciousness equal to himself. At the same time, the bondsman is able to derive satisfaction in labor, a process of working on and transforming objects through which he rediscovers himself and can claim a mind of his own. Analysis. This section of the Phenomenology, and for that matter the rest of the book, is difficult because of its abstractness. Hegel writes about lords and bondsmen, or masters and slaves, as it is sometimes translated, and it is hard at first to see whom he is talking about, and whether this is meant to describe social relations today, or at some period in the past when slavery was more widespread. Precisely because it is so abstract, the section has been interpreted in many different ways. It is possible to view the lord and bondsman relationship as an early stage of history, since the phenomenology describes the evolution of spirit throughout the course of human civilization, culminating in modern society. However, the dialectical evolution of spirit throughout history may also be seen as a metaphor for the process through which each individual develops psychologically. Thus, the images of the lord and bondsman may be interpreted not literally, but as metaphors for positions in which we all find ourselves throughout life, sometimes as the objectified bondsman, sometimes as the objectifying lord. The lordship and bondage section is among the most widely cited in all of Hegel's writings. The struggle for recognition between lord and bondsman inspired Marx's account of how class struggle naturally arises from the exploitation of one social class by another. A diverse array of 20th century thinkers, including psychoanalysts and existentialists, have drawn on Hegel's ideas here. Earlier idealists, such as Kant, pointed out the difference between subject and object, but Hegel believed that the subject, or the self, is aware of itself only as a distinct entity through the eyes of another self. The radical idea inherent in this view is that consciousnesses are inextricably interwoven, and that one cannot have any concept of oneself without having actually experienced a moment of identification with the other. Many readers have found his notion of self-consciousness easier to grasp intuitively than many of Hegel's other concepts. His account seems to ring true with everyday experience. People come to know themselves through the image they suppose others hold of them. This image is positive or negative depending on who that person is, where he or she stands in society, and so forth, and gives rise to familiar stresses as individuals strive to assert their free individuality against the objectifying images that others have of them. Phenomenology of Spirit, chapters 5 to 8. Free concrete mind and absolute knowledge. Summary. At the end of chapter 4, Hegel describes the unhappy consciousness that arises from individuals having to struggle for recognition from one another to realize themselves as self-conscious subjects. He asserts that various religious institutions and philosophical systems serve as a refuge from the fear and objectification that arise in this struggle. By turning toward a transcendent being, God, one can take comfort in a being that exists purely for itself, rather than in a struggle for recognition between beings, and thus isolate oneself from that struggle. This turn toward a transcendent being follows from the initial attempt of consciousness to grasp the nature of the object. The striving for sense certainty leads to perception and to the social nature of universal concepts. Hegel's understanding of the dialectical movement of thought leads him to take issue with the idealist notion of reason. Reason is not, as the Kantian idealists claim, a matter of fitting isolated objects into universal categories. Reason involves a self-conscious ego struggling to assimilate objects while having to fend off their otherness, which it sees as a threat to its existence as a self-conscious being. Like Kant, Hegel believes that reason leads consciousness to fit particular phenomena into universal categories. However, this process is not smooth and always involves an element of uncertainty and vagueness, since objects exist in a fluid spectrum of variations and do not readily conform to distinct universal categories. Thus, insofar as consciousness is oriented to those stable categories of thought, it is also aware of a set of standards governing how phenomena conform to such categories. These standards, or laws of thought, reside neither in the objects nor in the mind, but in a third dimension, in the organized social whole. When looking at the social dimension, we can see that every individual self-consciousness belongs to one collective self-consciousness, a locus of identity existing outside of every individual in the collective. Laws of thought, morality, and conventions belong to social life. Individual activities and interpretations conform to these laws as having a taken-for-granted existence, as matters at hand, and individuals see these common laws not as alien but as emanating from their own selves, as a law of one's own heart. Hegel calls this dimension of collective consciousness spirit. Spirit is the location of the ethical order, the realm of the laws and customs, to which individual consciousnesses assent, but that exist outside of individuals in the social being. Individuals interpret and act out laws and customs in an individual way, but they do so in tension with this communal spirit. The ethical communal spirit has two manifestations. First, it is the basis of the deep-seated ethical orientation of individuals, as an object of faith. Second, it has an outward existence as the culture and civilization of a given historical age. These two moments of ethical spirit or ethical life are in tension with each other. In modern Enlightenment culture, for example, the external cultural expression of ethical life, or spirit, is a kind of individualism. An emphasis on education and the acquisition of wealth actually orients consciousness away from the social being and the deep ethical life of which it is a part. In its most extreme negative form, individualism in the modern world finds expression in despotism and political terrorism. When political life is no longer a true expression of common ethical life, factions merely pretending to represent the collective will enforce their rule through terror and the annihilation of opposing factions. In its more positive guise, individualism finds expression in individual rights. The next stage in the development of consciousness is religion. Religion is essentially a collective spirit conscious of itself, and as such it reflects a given culture's expression of ethical life and the balance between individual and collective. There are different phases in the development of religion represented in the various world religions and reflected in art, myth, and drama. But religion is not the highest stage of consciousness. This place is reserved for absolute knowledge. Whereas with religion, spirit is conscious of itself in pictorial or poetic form. In the state of absolute knowledge, consciousness combines attention to subjective knowledge with attention to objective truth. That is, in absolute knowledge, spirit becomes aware of its limitations and seeks to correct its contradictions and inadequacies by moving to a higher plane of understanding. Absolute knowledge is self-conscious and critical engagement with reality. It is the standpoint of science and the starting point of philosophical investigation, an analysis. The religious connotations of the Hegelian term spirit have led many to believe that Hegel understands spirit as a kind of supernatural or divine force guiding human civilization and history. As noted, spirit is a translation of the German word Geist, which can also mean mind, and while spirit is reflected in religion, in itself it is actually something more like culture, or the collective mind of a social being. Ethical life is an expression of spirit in everyday reality. The ethical encompasses the common understandings, customs, and moral codes of a culture, a super-individual communal source of interpretation determining how people act, what they believe, and how they relate to the world and to the divine. Hegel says that even reason, which can't treat it as abstract and universal, is deeply embedded in collective culture. One of Hegel's most original and influential ideas is that culture is a dynamic force and subject to change. While deeply influenced by Kant and German idealism, Hegel was also close to the Romantic movement that was strong in Germany when he came of age intellectually. German Romantic philosophers such as Herder took issue with the image of the human experience that Kant and his students promoted. The Kantians and the rationalists of the Enlightenment sought to establish reason as a universal and unchanging bedrock of knowledge. The Romantics thought the Kantians did not fully appreciate the profound differences in human experience from age to age and culture to culture. Hegel came along to fuse the insights of both camps, and the resulting view sees the human mind striving for stable categories of thought and referencing the common interpretations and customs of society to do so. In other words, one approaches the world through a common mind. This common mind operates as a consciousness in and of itself, seeking to understand the world, bumping up against contradictions in the process, sorting through these contradictions, and moving forward. One gets a glimpse here of Hegel's view of history as the dynamic unfolding of the collective mind or spirit. Science of logic. Summary. Hegel begins by demonstrating that the categories of a thought through which the mind grasps objects are not as stable or certain as his predecessor Kant seems to assume. This instability even applies to that apparently fundamental universal category, being. To be able to say that something is, that it exists, implies another category, nothingness or not being. Being always implies nothingness, and vice versa, such that one cannot call to mind one category without invoking the other. Being and nothingness are understood as both opposed and identical, a unity of being and nothing. Consciousness experiences this unity of opposites as contradiction, which it seeks to resolve by invoking a third category called becoming, which captures both nothing and being at once. This dialectical process is how thought moves, according to Hegel's model. Consciousness posits a basic category that engenders a contradiction, is negated, and falls apart, creating a need for a more complex category that smooths over the contradiction. This new composite category in turn reveals its own contradiction and points to another category, and so on. Essence, the subject of Book 2, is a higher, more complex mode by which consciousness grasps objects. Consciousness of being tries to get at objects through the simple binary of being/not being, and through the outcome of the tension between these two categories, namely, becoming. Essence, on the other hand, points to qualities beyond mere existence or non-existence, to particular qualities of the object. These qualities manifest themselves in the appearances of objects. Instead of being or not being, objects appear to have different natures. Being and essence are both features of objective logic. That is, they pertain to qualities of objects themselves. Subjective logic, on the other hand, gets at ideal properties of knowledge, those emanating from products of the mind, namely concepts or notions, which make up the third and highest level of consciousness. It is at the level of concepts that subjective and objective are considered together. This is the domain of philosophy or metaphysics, where the concern is the interrelation of consciousness and inputs from the world of material objectivity, as analysis. The Phenomenology of Spirit is regarded as Hegel's first shot at establishing his own unique philosophical approach. He covers a lot of ground and introduces many of the major themes that reappear in his later philosophical writings, but the work is very confusing. His Science of Logic, published in stages beginning in 1812, is no less difficult for the uninitiated, but it benefits from the 5 intervening years Hegel had to reflect carefully on his ideas. The latter book is widely understood to be a more systematic treatise on ontology, which is the study of being, and epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. Here Hegel explicitly lays out his famous dialectic, the concept that, along with the equally challenging concept of Geist, is most frequently associated with his name. The slogan, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, has long circulated as a useful shorthand for understanding the basic idea of Hegel's dialectical method. However, Hegel himself never uttered this construction, and most Hegel scholars agree that it is both helpful and potentially misleading. In The Science of Logic, Hegel sets out to show that the process by which consciousness assimilates objects into mental concepts is more dynamic and, one might say, messier than Kant describes it. Just as he does in the Phenomenology, Hegel traces here the movement of consciousness, or the idea, from basic categories to more complex ones. Consciousness attempts to grasp objects at a most basic level, finds this first attempt somehow unsatisfying as exposing inadequacies or contradictions, and proceeds to a higher level, and so on. In the Phenomenology and elsewhere, Hegel seems to imply that this dialectical unfolding is an inherent feature of the world we inhabit, governing history and culture. In logic, we see that the dialectic is a phenomena of ideas, but the two dimensions of reality, that is, history, culture, and the world in general, and our ideal, mental or conceptual grasp of things, are not really separable. The world we live in is a world created by ideas, but our ideas do not emanate from the mind of a single individual, as other idealists such as Kant seem to imply. Concepts have an objective status. They exist outside of any individual as taken for granted reality. They belong to common cultural understanding. Philosophy of Right, I2. Abstract Right and Morality, Summary. The basis of individual rights lies in property. Property is not merely material acquisition. It is central to an individual's assertion of identity and personality. Property is an expression of self and the locus of an individual's claim to rights, since it is through property that one can say "this is mine," a claim that others respect. Property is the embodiment of personality, says Hegel. The system of private property establishes individuality and personality through contract and exchange. Contract establishes ownership through institutionalized norms of mutual respect of individual rights and obligations. Economic life governed by free exchange of commodities is based on an institutionalized notion of the individual as having some claim to recognition as a right-bearing person. If an exchange market is to function efficiently, economic actors must recognize universal standards by which a person can claim to own property. Established norms of reciprocal recognition in the modern economic sphere are internalized in economic actors and represent a common will. The concept of individual rights to which this common will gives its assent is an abstract concept. The individual it implies is a universal individual without particular traits and without reference to social or cultural environment. Thus, rights established by private property and exchange are abstract rights and engage individuals as abstract, universal subjects. The system of mutual recognition and abstract right is the basis of what Hegel calls morality. Morality is essentially the subjective side of reciprocal social obligations institutionalized in contracts and the economic market. Individuals experience such reciprocal obligations as a moral obligation to respect universal rights. Morality gestures toward what ought to be and frequently is not. It is an abstract ideal, a vision of good based on mutual recognition of rights. People are morally motivated through a sense of duty to defend the universal rights of individuals. Analysis. In Elements of a Philosophy of Right, Hegel attempts to fuse diverse elements of his philosophy and social thought into a grand statement about the nature of modernity. He traces a modern conception of individuality and of the individual as the bearer of rights to modern social, economic, and political institutions. He also describes how this modern notion of the individual, while positive in many ways, gives rise to certain stresses and to the alienation of the individual from the collective. In the first section, Abstract Right, Hegel returns to a theme of earlier writings in which he wrestles with the fairly common belief in natural rights that are present in the various social contract theories of, for example, John Locke, where social or political order is said to derive its legitimacy from its ability to uphold and protect the rights of autonomous, sovereign individuals. For Locke and others, the social is merely the outcome of a contract between autonomous individuals to respect each other's rights. In this view, the extent of one person's relationship to another can be summed up in the slogan, "Be a person and respect others as a person." Hegel believes this view of social life to be generally accurate, but he rejects the belief that contractual mutual recognition and the ideal of the universal rights-bearing individual it supports is a basis of all societies throughout history. The worldview implied in contract theory and in the moral obligation to respect individual rights is not the foundation of social life, but rather a reflection of the spirit of the modern age. This spirit resides in modern legal and economic institutions, which foster an idea of abstract rights and universal personhood. Hegel therefore applies his theory of history and culture to an analysis of the modern world. He also criticizes both contemporary political theory and idealist moral philosophy for not recognizing that the phenomena they recognize as universal laws are actually particular expressions of modern culture. Philosophy of Right. 3. Ethical Life. Summary. The morality that we see expressed in contracts and exchanges, which reflect a reciprocal respect between individuals for one another's rights, is only a particular expression of a wider and deeper dimension of moral life that Hegel calls ethical life. Ethical life is a system of norms and mores belonging to a social body, made up of spheres of social interaction and interdependence in which all individuals are embedded. Whereas morality turns people away from what is toward what ought to be, ethical life is merely what is, the set of meanings and practices that guide people in everyday activities whether they are aware of it or not. Ethical life is present in the three important levels of social life. In its most elementary form, it is present in the family and finds expression in basic emotions such as love and altruism. In civil society, a sphere of social interaction corresponds to economic life or the system of needs. Civil society engages individuals as bearers of abstract rights, as owners of property and bearers of legal rights. In civil society, individuals relate to one another in universal terms. While private property as the basis of abstract right and morality is a positive force in promoting individual freedom, individualistic material interests, such as the pursuit of economic gain, could potentially destabilize society. When left unchecked, these destabilizing forces tend to polarize humanity into rich and poor. The individualism of private material acquisition also weakens the expression of the basic social bonds and common culture that hold society together. Certain institutions must be in place to prevent the system of private property and the individualist worldview it sustains from undermining society itself. Government authority, in addition to providing basic infrastructure and protection from crime, must both promote and protect society from economic individualism, ensuring that those without property or work are provided for. Corporate institutions, such as guilds or labor unions, must be in place not just to look after the economic needs of workers and tradesmen, but to give them a sense of belonging and connection to the social whole of which they are a part. After the family and civil society, the third and highest moment of ethical life is the institution of the state. The state is the medium through which individuals come to realize their location in the ethical life of society as parts of a greater whole. The state is an expression of spirit unfolding in history through dialectical development. Whereas earlier forms of the state were imperfect expressions of collective spirit, the modern state has evolved as a rational adaptation to structures of modern life. Given the image of the universal person and the emergence of the autonomous rights-bearing individual, the modern state as the highest form of collective association, serves to integrate this vision of individual freedom and autonomy into an appreciation of common social bonds, preventing these two opposed tendencies from pulling society apart and allowing freedom and rights to coexist with a full expression of communal spirit. Analysis. Philosophy of Right is Hegel's most controversial work, as many readers objected to the central role he attributes to the state in realizing a reconciliation of modern individuality and freedom with the need for collective belonging. However, Hegel's model of the rational state, though by no means purely democratic, does not invest power in authority simply to suppress individuality. Hegel understands the state in terms that are somewhat unfamiliar to modern readers, who, in the wake of the totalitarian states that arose during the 20th century, tend to be skeptical of theories that give political institutions the task of solving society's problems. For Hegel, the state is not just a political and authoritarian entity, but the broadest arena of social relations corresponding to common culture or ethical life. It is in the institution of the state, therefore, that the contradictions of ethical life will reveal and fix themselves. In modern society, the role of the state is to reconcile the egoistic and individualizing tendencies of civil society with the need for common belonging. Hegel largely adopts Kant's description of the moral, rational individual, but believes that Kant's understanding of individuality is an expression of a particular historical epoch, namely of the modern world. Hegel is thus regarded as one of the first philosophers of modernity and of a particularly modern understanding of history. If there is a unifying ambition throughout his vast writings, this ambition lies in his attempt to describe the origins and implications of this image of the individual and how it relates to the religious, economic, and political aspects of modern life. Here he shows how this notion of individuality is rooted in practical life, but also that it has a fundamental tension with the expression of ethical life.